The lady on this next slide is A.J. Levine. She is the professor of New Testament at Vanderbilt University, a brilliant Bible teacher. She's been here in Nebraska. When she came, her hair was as black as her sweater there, so it's been a while since she was here, but she's a brilliant lady. And she said that this parable of the Good Samaritan is one of Jesus' most relevant parables to today. And so I've borrowed some of her thoughts and incorporated them into this sermon. Now, the reason that this parable is so relevant is, as you heard Bill read, Jesus told it in response to the question from the lawyer, "Who is my neighbor?" In there, this lawyer, I think the New Revised Standard Version said the lawyer was putting him to the test. And that word that's used there, test, is the same one that's used when the devil tested Jesus or tempted him in the wilderness. So this lawyer wasn't legitimately seeking any kind of help or answers or counsel from Jesus. He was just trying to trip him up, trying to show him to be a fraud or something like that. Well, Jesus asked the lawyer how he read the law. And he said, as you heard, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said, "Good." You know, bingo. They didn't have a game then, but he would have said, "Bingo, you got it right. Do that." And really, if we had one English word to sum it up, what he really said was, keep on doing that. Keep on loving God. Keep on loving your neighbor, and you'll live. But this guy, being a lawyer, asked the central question for most people in that command to love your neighbor. And he said, "Well, who is my neighbor?" See, I think the lawyer was really interested in finding out who he could get by hating and who he was required by the commandment to love. Well, that was when Jesus responded by telling the story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, I've heard that this road is really bad, and this is a picture of that road. And man, no wonder it was a dangerous road. Apparently there were a lot of curves and a lot of boulders that thieves could hide behind. Well, it was a dangerous road, and robbers jumped the guy as he was headed down to Jericho, and they robbed him and beat him up and left him for dead. And you heard, as Bill read it, first a priest came by and didn't stop, and then a Levite came by again, didn't stop, but finally a Samaritan came by. Now, a Samaritan wasn't just some neutral person to the Jews. Like I told the kids, saying that they had cooties, is pretty mild. Remember all of those wars between northern Israel and southern Israel? That was the Samaritans fighting the Jews. And there was lots of bloodshed, lots of animosity for hundreds of years between the Samaritans and the Jews. So when the Samaritan came along, you can tell that Jesus was setting the story up. most Jews would probably have rather died than to be touched by a Samaritan. Kind of like in some places years ago, a lot of white folks would rather have died than had a black person help them. I remember seeing a movie when I was a kid. I think Sidney Poitier was in it. It was called All the Young Men, where there were a bunch of Marines fighting in Korea. And one guy was wounded and had to have a transfusion, or he was going to die. The only person in the whole outfit that could give him a transfusion was a black officer who was in command. And this guy was a Southerner, and you can imagine back in the 1950s during the Korean War, the kind of reaction a Southerner would have waking up and find out that not only did a black person touch them, they had black blood flowing in their veins. So that's a lot of background to why this story is so critical to today. You might ask, why in the world that priest and that Levite didn't stop and help the guy who was laying there in the ditch all beat up and nearly dead? And I've always thought that it was because of the cleanliness laws. Jews were told not to do this or that or the other, to make them unclean, and in fact they're not supposed to touch dead bodies, especially priests. The only time a priest was supposed to touch a dead body would be like if his sister was a widow and had to live in his house and she died, then the priest would be allowed to take care of her body so she could be buried. But otherwise, priests weren't supposed to have anything to do with the dead body if you just stick with the scriptures. But A.J. Levine said, well, there are other scriptures and the way it was interpreted, and some of the other rabbinic writing of the day made it clear that the priest and the Levite really were obligated to stop and help the guy who had been beaten up. And Levine said she agrees with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assessment of that situation, that the reason they didn't stop was because they were afraid. King said in his sermon on the Good Samaritan, and so the first question that the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? That guy could just be bait. When somebody would come to help him, the robbers would jump out because they got somebody stopped and robbed them too. But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? See, Levine said that the priest and the Levite, just like that lawyer who came asking Jesus questions, are the similarity among all those things is that all of them were thinking only of themselves. They weren't thinking of the hurting person in the ditch. And the question is whether we act in our self-interest or whether we act for the good of others. Well, you heard Bill read the whole story. The Samaritan took the wounded man to an inn, stayed with him, and took care of him overnight. The next morning, he gave the innkeeper the equivalent of $200 in today's money, and said, if it takes any more than that, I'll make it up to you when I come back this way next time. Levine noted that the Samaritan's act of giving the innkeeper money to take care of the injured man and saying that he would repay him was not one-time aid, but long-term care. Thus, the sense of loving neighbor means continual action. It's not just something to check off a to-do list. As Jesus said to the lawyer, keep on doing this and you'll live. Well, Jesus asked that lawyer which of those three had been a neighbor to the man who had been robbed. And the lawyer answered, well, the one that had mercy on him. He couldn't even bring himself to say, well, it was a Samaritan, because the lawyer could not imagine the enemy being a neighbor. And maybe we wouldn't be so anxious to fight with one another if we understood that the people we regard as an enemy or as enemies are actually neighbors. This whole parable is about relationship. So, the question comes to us, who is your neighbor? Because Jesus said, go and do likewise, when the lawyer said, well, the one that had mercy on him. A lot of you probably know, it's been on the news in different places about the special general conference that just went on in St. Louis recently. And it was kind of an unusual general conference. The vote went to continue the United Methodist prohibition against same-sex marriages and against ordaining gay clergy. But an additional part of what was passed was to provide more accountability so that if somebody in another part of the world is doing something that you think is wrong, anybody could go and bring charges against them. And before the final vote, before the plenary vote, they also asked the Judicial Council, which is the United Methodist Supreme Court, to take a look at this legislation, the traditional plan that had been passed. And the Judicial Council did, and they came back and said a large portion of this plan is unconstitutional because it undercuts the authority of bishop within his or her annual conference. So, the plenary session voted for it anyway. If it hasn't happened yet, the Judicial Council is going to come and say that's unconstitutional, and we're going to go back to the way things are, only to repeat the whole thing again in 2020. So Bill Ritter, wow, there it came on. Bill Ritter, our district superintendent, was coming back from St. Louis because he had attended part of the session just to see what was going to happen. And said he was driving along and he was going to stop at a Sonic someplace in Missouri to get a hamburger so he could just keep driving, and he was going to get back to Lincoln late anyway. But as happens to old guys frequently, all of a sudden, man, he had to stop and use the restroom. And there was a rest stop right there. Yeah, you have to kind of be an old guy to really appreciate that. But he stopped at this rest stop, took care of his business, and came out, and there was only one other car at the whole rest area. It was bitter cold. And there was a young woman standing there by her car, just standing there. car, I don't remember whether he said it was running or not, but he went over and he said, excuse me, I'm not going to harm you or anything like that. My name is Reverend Bill Ritter. And she said, yeah, I know, I can see it on your name tag there, because they have these big name tags, right? And he said, oh yeah, okay, sorry. And he said, are you having some trouble? And she said, I locked my keys in my car. Turned out she was from Indiana, was traveling to Fort Collins, Colorado, stopped at this rest stop, locked her keys in the car. And he said, well, do you know who to call? And she said, well, that doesn't do me any good anyway, because my phone is in the car with the keys. So he said, okay, here, unlocked his phone and said, here, you can make a call. He said, I've got AAA, but AAA, since she wasn't a member, wouldn't come out and help her, even though Bill said, well, put it on my dime, but no, they wouldn't do that. So he said, well, call 911. They finally hooked her up with a tow truck, and the tow truck said, okay, before we come out, we need a credit card. And her credit card was with her phone, with the keys inside the car. So Bill pulled out his credit card and said, you better pay me back for this. Let her use his credit card number and stayed there until the tow truck guy came, got her car unlocked, and got her on her way. Now, Bill said after that general conference, a lot of people were upset on both sides. The people who are sort of the traditionalists were upset because after all their work, nothing was going to change. It was all going to go back to the way it was. People who really wanted to see the church hold together, but for people to have more freedom locally to choose whether they wanted to allow same-sex weddings in their church, in their area, or have homosexual clergy ordained. Those folks are upset, and the ones that stay in the church, like I said, they're going to come in 2020 to try again. And you know, the difference at this general conference was 27 votes. If 27 people had voted differently, the traditional plan would not have been approved. And we would have gone to the one church plan that says, okay, kind of every region decides for themselves what their procedure is going to be. Bill said everybody was pretty well bummed out and distressed. But he said that situation helped him get perspective on the fact that there are hurting people who need help that we come in contact with almost every day. And if we stop worrying about sex and who's sleeping with who, maybe we can focus on helping our neighbors in need. And I thought, wow, what a great thing. So we could be in mission with one another. Thanks be to God that God keeps giving us opportunities, doing things like people locking their keys in their cars and all kinds of things like that. But God always gives us opportunities for showing the love of Jesus to those around us. Amen and amen.